Firecrawl is the best web scraping, web crawling API for your no-code project. And in this Bob tutorial video, I'll be showing you how to use the Firecrawl Crawl endpoint. I'll be demoing in their playground first just to show you how versatile it is, and then we'll be moving over to the Bubble API connector and building a really simple Bubble app that's going to crawl a website and then display the results back to the user. So let's dive in with a demo first of all. HubSpot is a giant when it comes to marketing, so it's great to keep an eye on what they're writing. But what I wanted to know what blog posts they were posting, and in particular, whether they are talking about AI. Well, I can do that by using the Crawl API and by just tinkering with a few of the parameters here. So firstly, I don't need it to pass PDFs. I'm going to limit it just down to 5 results because this is just a test. I want to keep my costs down. And then if I go over to here, you can see I'm going to probably use the term versatile a lot in this video because you can just do a ton of things with Firecrawl, including let's get back a summary, but also let's get back a JSON response. So I'm going to say mentions AI and have that as a Boolean, and I'm going to say how AI used, and then in my prompt I'm going to write does this blog post mention AI and how is AI being used. Okay, and I'm going to click save, and then let's start our crawl. So one thing which we're going to touch on when we get to the Bubble API connector and building our Bubble app is that although here I'm only crawling 5 pages, if I was crawling 100 pages, 1,000 pages, it's going to take more than a few seconds to process. And so we're going to have to use a webhook. We'll be giving a backend endpoint to Firecrawl, and then Firecrawl will be informing us when the crawl is complete, and then we'll be fetching the data. And that's all going to be covered in the second half of this video. But we can see here that we've got our results back. So we've got some lovely summaries. First of all, the main page of blog.hubspot.com, and then we can see that it's actually crawling the blog posts on HubSpot. And if I go into JSON, we can see we get all of this amazing data back. And right the way down, we can see even our JSON. So we can ask questions, and Firecrawl is going to answer those questions. Like this one here is looking at how AI can be used for predictive lead scoring. Yeah, great for marketing. What have we got here? Scroll all the way down. AI is being used with usage pricing. So there's just tons of things you could do with this. You could do with, if you're building an app, some sort of marketing app, and your users are wanting their own site analyzed, you could set up your own kind of framework that you test the site against, and you could crawl multiple pages, and then you could compile those results in a table in Bubble, or you could have your users compare their sites against their competitors. All of that is possible with the versatile Firecrawl API. So how do we go from running this in the Firecrawl Playground to our Bubble app? Well, thankfully, and I love this when developer-focused tools do it, it's as simple as copying and pasting some code. In fact, everything that we set up here, if I go get code and go over to CURL, Firecrawl has written it out for us. And so we just have to take this, which, yeah, first time you do it can look a little bit daunting, but I'm going to take you through each step. We take this and we add it into our bubble.io app. So here's a completely fresh blank bubble.io app. It's a blank page. I've not even installed any plugins yet. I've not built anything. We go over to plugins and we go add plugins, and we add in the Bubble API connector. This is your doorway to thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other developer APIs, including Firecrawl. So I'm going to install it and then add in a new API. And I can label these whatever I like, but I'm going to call it Firecrawl because it is. And then private key in header. So let me walk you through how we translate what we saw in the playground into the Bubble API connector. We can see here that we are making a post request, and we are making it to this endpoint here. So I'm going to copy this. And that we have to, in the header of the call, authorization, bearer, and our API key. It also says we need content type application JSON. We don't have to supply that because that is now a default header value in Bubble. So if I go back over here, private key and header, I'll come back to that. But let's set up our call. We'll say crawl, and it's a post request. We paste in our endpoint. Let's get our API key. I would, of course, be rolling this, refreshing it, deleting it before publishing the video. Just making sure I've got the key and nothing else. We have to include the word bearer in there. And then this is an easy mistake to make in Bubble. I wish that they defaulted it the other way around, but we want it to be used as an action because this is going to be someone clicks a button and an action takes place in a workflow. Then, final bit, just move the HubSpot, there we go, is that we copy everything inside of the quote marks in data. JSON syntax is very unforgiving. You make a mistake here, you're going to get an error. We paste it into body. If you don't see body, it's because you haven't selected post up here. And we can see that the playground has compiled the code for us. So something that might be a bit daunting, a bit tricky to get right, such as the JSON structure that we want with our does it mention AI and how AI is used as a string. And then the prompt, if you get a comma out of place here, it's going to cause an error. We're just copying and pasting it from Firecrawl. We now need to initialize the call, and this is our way of checking that everything we've done so far is working. And it is also our way of training Bubble what sort of response to get back from the API. So let's go ahead and initialize our call. And notice it is very quick. This is because we're not waiting for the crawl action to take place. It is simply happening on Firecrawl. And we get back a success status. So we know that it has successfully started, but we don't know that if and when it finishes. So I'm going to click save because we want to train Bubble that this is what the response looks like. But we now need to supply a webhook. So if I go into the crawl documentation here, we can see everything that can be sent across with the crawl endpoint, including webhook. So I'm going to copy this bit here. Not necessarily in the right line, but in the right hierarchy of the code. So I got the mistakes, common mistakes here are to not separate things by commas. So I've got a comma after where the start of where I inserted it, and I'm going to add a comma in afterwards. Let's break down exactly what we pasted in. We're saying that on the event that is completed, so we only want to inform our webhook when the crawl is completed. There are other statuses, but we'll just ignore those. We want the final result is completed, and then we can send through specific headers, which if you wanted to really secure your endpoint, you could send through a header value and check against it, but we're just going to get it working for starters. So I'm going to remove that. Now, interestingly, in the Firecrawl documentation, they've wrapped their string value in triangle brackets. Bubble here gives us a clue that when we wrap a value in the body section, some text in the body section in triangle brackets, we are making it a dynamic value. Now, when you send a value through the API connector in the midst of some JSON, it's important to make sure that that is stringified text or that is made JSON safe. So we actually want to remove the speech marks because we will be adding the speech marks back in using a text modifier in the workflow. I'm going to explain it in more detail when we get to it. But it's effectively if a user were to put some special characters in like a colon or some speech marks, how does the JSON know what is JSON and what is text? Well, that is part of this text modifier, which we'll be adding in our workflow. But right now, I'm just going to rename this to webhook URL. And then I like to add in JSON to remind myself when I get to the workflow, I need to JSON safe it. It's not private. When you see private mentioned in the API connector, so I'm going to uncheck that, it's referring to things like your API key. When you run a workflow in Bubble in the front end, you should consider that everything that is sent in the workflow could be accessible to your user if they open up their browser DevTools and they look at what is being sent between the Bubble server and the browser. So we need to ensure that our API key is private, but all of this information, that's not private. I'm going to do the same for URL, which is right in like that. Okay. Now, if I wanted to reinitialize my call here, it would fail because I'm sending some empty values here and they're required values, and the JSON syntax is going to fail. So I would add in my speech marks back in, and now comes the part where we train our backend workflow in Bubble to receive that notification that the crawl has completed. So I need to go into backend workflows. This bit, you need to be on a paid Bubble plan or a 14-day free trial of a plan in your Bubble app to use backend workflows. So I go new, create a workflow, and it is an API workflow. I'm just going to call this Firecrawl. It needs to be exposed to the public because Firecrawl is external to our Bubble app, and it needs to be able to send data in. And then we need to be able to run this without authentication because Firecrawl is not acting as a logged in user. We then put it into request data and detect data. And this is now in like a training mode. It's waiting to have data sent into it because we have to train Bubble what format of data is coming in so that we can use that data as steps within our workflow. Let's just break down what's going on here exactly. We've got our Bubble app subdomain. If you have a custom domain on your Bubble app, it's going to replace everything up to here. We've then got the version of our Bubble app. So this is our version test. We need to make sure that our version is dynamic when we send it off to Firecrawl so that users in our live version get their responses sent to the live version's endpoint. So we would swap out test for live, or I think you can even remove that whole section. We then have initialize at the end. This is saying our this particular endpoint is our initialize endpoint, but when we actually come to use it in our app, we need to remove initialize. Don't worry, I'm going to be covering each of those bits when we get to it. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm also going to open this app in a new tab because I need to make sure that this remains open while I go into the API connector and put in the URL. So with initialize, wrapped in speech marks. And then I also want to add in the HubSpot URL again into here. So speech marks, otherwise it's going to fail. So what should happen here is that when I reinitialize the call, Firecrawl is going to do all the same things, but it's going to send a notification to my backend workflow, which is in this ready state to receive the webhook. So let's initialize the call. Going to click save. Going to come back over here. And now we just need to wait. Remember, when we ran it in the playground, it probably takes like a second or two to crawl each page. And actually, you want a web crawler or a web scraper to pace itself because you don't want to hammer a website and just get it blocked. That's all part of the clever, intelligent setup. One of the reasons why Firecrawl is one of the best ones out there, because you want it to pace itself. You don't want it to rush this step. Okay, we've got our success, but notice we don't actually have any of the data. That's because we need to make a follow-up request to Firecrawl to actually get the data of the crawl. And the way we do that is by acknowledging and using our ID. So this is the ID of the crawl. So I'm going to save this. And then if we go back into the crawl documentation, we need to get crawl status. So we need to add another API call. This time it is get, and it is to this endpoint where we dynamically insert ID at the end. So I'm going to copy that and go add in another call. I make sure that all of this is within the same API call as kind of the same parent structure because it runs through the same API key. Into here, I paste that endpoint. And in the in this field, in the API connector, we use square brackets to make it dynamic. So if I swap those out, we then get the field. It's not private. I'm going to paste in the ID that I got from my call earlier. I've got a clipboard manager that we're managing it, but it might be helpful just to paste that into a note. Otherwise, you'd have to run the call again. Or indeed, you could go back into your Firecrawl account, and I think you could probably get the ID there. this is an action again, because it's going to be an action in our workflow, and I'm going to initialize the call. So now we should actually get access to the data. Here we go. This is exactly what we saw coming out of the playground when we first ran it. And notice too that Bubble will do a really good job of detecting the types of fields and values that come back, including the fact that data is a list. So if we want to view everything, we actually have to go in here. And so we can see that each of these, there we go, that's one web page. And then here's another web page. Down to here, yeah. And so there are 5 of these. So I'm going to click save because once more, this is training Bubble on the data that comes back. So if we go back into our workflow, we would then add in, if I search for Firecrawl, I've got Firecrawl API call. That's because I didn't rename it. So I'm going to say get crawl. And if you still don't see it in the workflow, it's because you've not changed this to action or you've not initialized it successfully. So if I go for Firecrawl, here's my action that I've created. The ID, well, that's coming in from our request data. So now this is accessing the data that goes in at the top end of the API call. ID, right. So now we know that we're getting back the data from Firecrawl, and now we want to save it into our Bubble database in order to show it to our users. So let's go into data and let's create a new data type. We'll just call this web page. And this is not going to cover, otherwise it will be way too long. This is not going to cover design in Bubble. This is not going to cover privacy rules, securing data within the database. We're just going to get to a point where we can input a URL as a user and we can get back the crawled results. So on web page, let's add in, let's call this URL. And then let's have summary. Let's have mentions AI, and this will not be a text field, it will be a yes/no field, which is what Bubble calls a Boolean value. We get back true or false, Bubble translates that into yes/no. And then there's also how is AI used, and that will be a text field. Okay, so now how do we take the X number, because we might not always want 5 web pages to come back. How do we create 5 things in the Bubble database? Well, this is where Bubble is kind of a little bit at odds with traditional coding, which is you would put like a loop or a for loop in here. Bubble doesn't have that, but Bubble can work with lists. So we need to add in a new workflow, backend workflow. And this is what we want done with a single thing that comes back. We're getting back 5 things. What single thing do we want to happen to each of those 5 things? So I like to call it, I'll say something like web page single, and I like to write single in to remind me that this is happening to one thing in the response. And then the parameters we want to pass in are URL, summary, use mentions AI, which is a yes/no value, and how AI text. So you can label these whatever you want. They kind of become, they become values in this workflow. And then for each one thing, we want to create a thing. So we create a thing in the database web page, and then we just match these up. And these are the values that we've created here. We're basically just passing data in to a particular key and then, matching it up. So how is AI used? Mentions AI. If you don't get blue on here, it's because you've mismatched the kind of data type here. Summary and URL. So now for every instance of these 4 values that we pass into this workflow, we will create one web page in our database. So if I go back here, we then let's go schedule API workflow on list. Don't be put off by the term schedule. You can schedule it to happen in the future. You can use this in Bubble to say send an email in the month. But right now we're just going to say send it, or rather run this workflow immediately. What are we wanting to send through? We are dealing with lists here, and we want to send through API call data. Why API called data? Well, that's because it is the data field within the API call. So we're not accessing it at the top level. We actually need to drill down to data, because that's then where we get the list of our web pages. So the list is on the results of step 1, because that's our get crawl request, and then it is data. So if this doesn't match up, it's because what you've selected here isn't the type of list that is selected here. And Bubble will actually give you a prompt, or it will turn red to indicate that there's been a mismatch. Then what workflow do we want to run? Well, on each, so up here, we're dealing with a list, and then down here, we're dealing with a single item. So for each item in the data, we want to run the web page single workflow, and the URL is not from request data, because that's dealing with the list. We're on this single bit here. This API calls data. We're now dealing with a single thing in the list. So here's URL. Here's summary. This API calls AI. So we can see here it's in JSON, mentions AI, and then AI. How AI used. Cool. Interval we'll leave empty, because we want it just to self-optimize how quickly it runs these. Right, that's our backend workflow sorted. We now just need to design a really simple bit of UI to get this working. So we will add in an input, because we want to take a URL. Remember, this is not a lesson on how to design things in Bubble. You'd be using rows and columns if you wanted to design a truly responsive layout. This is not going to be responsive. It's just going to be functional. So I'll call this crawl. And I'll say here, enter URL to crawl. Notice how when you edit the placeholder, it updates the internal label. That's useful when we come to the workflow in a moment. And then we want to let's add in a table, because we want to display our data. And so this is just going to be a list of all of the web pages we can find in the database. I can then add in some labels here. Then our row 1 is our template for all of our following rows. So we've got our header row and we've got our row 1. So in here, I'll print in the URL. So we are making it dynamic, and we're saying current row's web pages URL. And then I like to copy and paste, but we'll go summary. And then let's do something a bit different, because this is a Boolean value. Yes, no. So we can either just print yes or no, bit boring. We can go format as text. So we can say this uses AI, this doesn't use AI. Okay, so that's just going to print either one of those. And then how is AI used? We shall say that is this one here. We now need to add a workflow to this button. So when this button is clicked, we need to run the action, which is our first crawl here. So I go Firecrawl, crawl, and then we've got these two dynamic values here, because they are the two dynamic values that we've added into the body section. So let's do the URL first, because that's simple. We target our input on our page, which was labeled enter URL to crawl value. And then this is what I said about JSON safe 10 minutes ago, is we add in a text modifier JSON safe. That will make safe any special characters, but it will also wrap the whole thing back in speech marks. That's why we removed the speech marks in the body section of the API connector. I'm going to copy this to clipboard. I'm going to use arbitrary text. And the reason I use arbitrary text is that then means that anything that I write within arbitrary text, I know is going to be made JSON safe as the final step. I'm going to paste this in here. and remove the speech marks because I don't want it to initialize anymore. But I also need to make the version, this bit here, dynamic, because when I deploy this app to live, if I was going to do that, this is the endpoint for the test for the dev version. And if I have a live user running the call, it's not actually going to turn up in the right database because Bubble has separate databases for different versions. Now, the best workaround here is if I just add in a text label and then I go home, website home URL, and then I go preview. Okay, we can see it will print us this part. And I had to run this myself just to check, does it end in a slash? And yes, it does. So if we want it to print this in our workflow, I'm going to do that in a moment because this is vital because it will ensure that the right domain is placed in this bit and the right version is placed in this bit. So we're replacing everything, including the final backslash, with home URL. Okay, and then everything that's printed here gets JSON saved before it gets sent off to the API. Let's add in a little bit of fun. Let's add in a confirmation. So I'm going to use a toast notification. This is just a really good looking notification library. So I've added the plugin. When you add a plugin and it's doing something visible on a page, you have to add the element to the page in most cases. So if I go here and then I want to show the toast notification, nothing's coming up, or notify, no, nothing's coming up. That's because it's effectively loading Toast, which is, I think, like an open source notification library. It needs to load that library onto the page. And we do that by adding in notify, and you would just hide this somewhere on your page. I'm going to put this as top center. And then now I go into my workflow, I can access the notify. And let's make this a little bit longer. And we'll say sent request to Firecrawl. Okay, now let's give this a test. So we're going to go into our preview. I'm going to get my HubSpot URL, paste it in, and click crawl. So that's our lovely toast notification. It will stay there for 10 seconds. And we are just now waiting for Firecrawl to complete the crawl of each of the pages, for Firecrawl to send a notification to our webhook, for our webhook URL at that backend endpoint to go and get the data from Firecrawl and then create each of the items in our database. So if I go into Bubble, we might be able to see some of it happening. If I go into here and then web pages, no, nothing's happening just yet. There we go. We literally saw it populate before our eyes. And here it is in our table on our front end. So if you wanted to take this further, here's what I suggest, that you get scripts with privacy rules, because at the moment, any user who visits this app can create web pages, then kind of not partitioned by user. So get scripts with privacy rules. And then obviously there's a lot of design that can go in to improve this. But we have shown the core function of the Firecrawl Crawl API. And if you want to get started with Firecrawl, then there is a link down in the description to do just that. And remember, when you sign up to Firecrawl, you can also get access to Scrape, which is a great way of scraping a web page and getting rid of all the fluff around it, headers, footers, just getting back clean data in Markdown if you want, or a summary. You can crawl entire websites. You can do search. This is useful if you want to keep an eye on a particular niche, maybe to inspire social media posts. You can map, which is effectively building a sitemap for a website, which you can pair then with other endpoints, and then you can extract data from an entire website. So there really is no better solution out there if you want to web scrape, web crawl, get data from websites that aren't yours. The best place to do that is with Firecrawl, and you can click the link down in the description to get started.